I definitely think that the sort of feuding or kind of disparate perspectives between these different groups also had an effect, because I think it meant that once policymakers started calling in experts and saying, okay, what do we do? What problems should we worry about? How do we fix them? If they're getting, 5 different answers when they call 5 different people, that's very difficult. It makes it very difficult to kind of coalesce around a certain set of solutions.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Kevin Frazier, assistant professor at St. Thomas University College of Law and a Tarbell Fellow at Lawfare, joined by CSET's Helen Toner and Zach Arnold.
When things have gone wrong with these systems, we want to know that that's happened. We want to understand, to the extent we can, what contributed to those failures, and we want to diffuse that information back out to the community of model developers and others. That kind of just makes sense as a matter of good practice. And it's not something we have in any systematic way in AI right now.
Today, we're discussing the landscape of AI governance advocacy and potential paths forward, based on Zach and Helen's recent Lawfare article, provocatively titled, AI Regulations Champions Can Seize Common Ground or Be Swept Aside.
Helen, your recent law review article describes 2 camps in AI regulation advocacy, the Doomers and the Ethicists. Who are these folks and what are their respective priorities?
We should probably start by saying that, we talked about 2 camps because that makes it easy to write an article, to go back and forth between 2 perspectives. Of course, in reality, the world of AI policy advocates and commentators is much more multidimensional and complicated. But the simplification we offered was between, I think maybe a better terms that I would use if it wouldn't get really unwieldy in a written piece, would be people focused on current harms from AI. So meaning looking at what kinds of things are we already observing? We're observing non-consensual deepfakes. We're observing algorithmic bias affecting people who are subject to decisions being made by algorithmic systems or AI systems that are, somehow making decisions that are not working well for the demographic group they belong to. These other, lots of different examples of ways that AI systems are already causing harm in the world today. And there's a significant community based around thinking about what are those harms, how do we prevent them, and so on. And a separate community, which, so we call that first community the ethicists in the piece for brevity. The separate community, sometimes known as Doomers, though I think that term really, it's very unclear who exactly counts as a Doomer. But certainly there is a community focused on looking at more sort of future-focused risks, anticipated risks, speculative risks. People have different words for this. But this is more thinking about, we've seen this trajectory of AI getting more advanced over the last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And what happens if we project that out? If we think that these systems might keep getting more advanced, might at some point be, as capable, as smart as a human, maybe more capable or smarter. Obviously, all of these definitions, what is smart, they're all very contested. But the basic idea is you extrapolate out the trends, you have much, much more sophisticated computers and machines that can do things we currently think of as only things that humans can do. There's a whole community, that thinks about what are the risks that come from that. Does that lead to human extinction? Maybe. Does that lead to other really bad outcomes like total disempowerment of humanity? Maybe. And so that is sort of the other camp that we describe here. And as we get into in the piece, in some ways these 2 camps have a lot in common in that they're looking at this technology and saying, oh, we have concerns. We think there's a need for greater involvement from government, from civil society, from others. But in practice, they often come to loggerheads.
What's really interesting to me is I agree that there's certainly a spectrum, right? Of some people have a portfolio of risks they're concerned about. They may be 30% an ethicist and 70% a doomer. So there's certainly a spectrum, but I do think it's worth pointing out how many people, if you just get on X right now, in their tagline, their little byline, will identify explicitly as a doomer or an EAC, an effective accelerationist. So the willingness to self-identify is kind of interesting. And with that sort of self-identification and the entrenchment of some of these camps, Zach, is the difference between these groups more akin to the Jets and the Sharks, which is to say serious and perhaps irresolvable, or is it more like a dispute between members of a boy band, which is to say fleeting and flexible?
Well, I think our piece is arguing that maybe the boy band scenario we could get a little closer to. In practice, there are serious divides between folks who tend to embrace, this doomer label, which among other things makes it convenient to write about them. And those who are, focused elsewhere, right? I think we point out in the piece, there's, sociological divides, political divides. A lot of the concerns of sort of the ethicist camp, as we term them, are, focusing on racial bias, gender bias, marginalization of disempowered groups, and how AI is affecting it and could affect that in the future. On the other hand, there's among the doomer contingent, again, to the extent you can draw lines around it, a lot of them are, coming out of Silicon Valley, maybe a little more sort of libertarian or unclassifiable in their political leanings. So there is kind of, some political and ideological valence to this. There's also, to be frank, in my opinion, there's a little bit of just sort of this for many years was an academic debate, vigorously contested. And now that debate is spilling into DC, spilling into, all sorts of places and all sorts of discussions as AI becomes, an economic and political force. So the aphorism about, academic politics are so contentious because the stakes are so small, I don't think applies here, at least not anymore. But you still do see some of that vigorous debate. And I think part of our motivation in writing this piece was to say, step back, the fundamental frame that you all are in is not as different as you might think. And there is common ground that is a little bit underexplored, certainly at a minimum relative to, other groups who are increasingly coming into this debate that was, previously kind of the Doomers and Ethicists fighting it out, and have a very different perspective altogether. Let's do very little or let's do nothing on the regulatory front.
And what's interesting is that for so long, or for as long as AI has been a policy concern, we heard this narrative that, it's not necessarily a partisan issue. And we can't really map this on to blue and red categories. But you all kind of suggest that there may be some increasing signs of these camps moving into particular partisan communities. Helen, can you describe a little bit more about how you see maybe a partisan home for each of these groups, or maybe an increasingly receptive audience among some partisan communities?
I'm actually not sure that I would agree that it's becoming more partisan. I'm unsure, and AI policy touches so many different topics that there are definitely places that are slightly more partisan than others. One way in which this maybe is relevant is kind of what Zach touched on, of what are the communities that these different groups are coming from. So you do have some advocates who are clearly coming from more of a left progressive perspective, and they're going to tend to center issues that are more, familiar to the left progressive camp. So things like climate or labor rights or those kinds of questions. Whereas you also have, others coming from more of a sort of tech Silicon Valley, maybe somewhat national security inflected area. But I think it's interesting when you look at the specific policymakers and policies that are being proposed here. I don't think it breaks down particularly clearly on partisan lines, which I think is a good sign for the space, because obviously that's, down that road lies dysfunction and paralysis. But if you look at things like in Congress, and I think some of, the work that's being done by, Blumenthal and Hawley in the Judiciary Committee of the Senate, for example, or looking at, you certainly have the Ted Cruzes of the world who are just anti all regulation in every form. But that doesn't seem to have been taken up as a kind of rallying cry for the Republican Party as a whole on AI. If you look at, for example, again, Hawley or Mitt Romney proposing frameworks, or others, Jay Bernalty in the House being very active on these issues. So I think it could just be, wishful thinking on my part, but I like to think that it's not at all clear that we're getting into kind of real partisan entrenchment here. Though, of course, we'll see what happens with the upcoming election and continued progress in the tech.
It is a really interesting space to see the evolution of, I guess it was the fall of 2023 when Senator Schumer and I believe Chair Khan each may have suggested that they had a PDOOM. We're not hearing so much about PDOOMs anymore, and innovation, it seems, has become a much more frequent moniker of certain senators and certain members of the House. So, Zach, earlier you were mentioning that some new players have come to the fore in a lot of these regulatory debates, and I think that's maybe most evident actually in California right now in the ongoing debate about SB 1047 and big tech at least partially being opposed, if not vehemently opposed, depending on who you ask, to what others regard as light touch regulation. So, how has the intervention of big tech kind of changed this regulatory paradigm and maybe made things a little bit more complex?
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit in DC, and the folks working on SB 1047 out in California, I'm sure could give you a different earful. But we've seen, from my perspective, what was really a specialist domain, in some ways a very obscure domain. I mean, particularly before sort of ChatGPT and the advent of sort of generative AI in the public consciousness, this has become sort of a major battlefield for major economic and political interests, as its economic and political significance has grown as a technology. Right, it's no longer the case that it's sort of a handful of enthusiasts or folks with the foresight or the inclination to think about AI. You now have tens of millions of dollars, if not more, going into lobbying in DC. You have major corporations sort of fully mobilized, developing very coherent regulatory or anti-regulatory agendas. This is, and I think, again, part of the motivation of the piece is just to underscore, this is not a space where sort of the ethicists and the doomers, as we simplify them, are sort of the only actors. And, one's going to win over the other in the end and get its way. The trend right now, to be frank, looks like both of them might end up marginalized by, very sophisticated, very powerful political and economic actors who have their own set of interests that don't necessarily correlate with the regulation of any risks, whether those are risks happening right now or risks that might emerge in the future. I think SB 1047 is sort of the culmination of this sort of phase where you see regulation, very much championed by in my view, one of these two camps, but nonetheless sort of people with a orientation toward this is an issue one way or another we need to regulate, coming up against, in some ways, sort of single-handedly conjuring into being a large, very well organized, transpartisan, to Helen's comments, and potentially victorious opposition. We'll see in the end what Governor Newsom does. But I think this has been sort of, among other things, fascinating to watch, sort of the development of, in many ways, sort of normal high stakes political showdown in an area that just hasn't quite seen anything like that yet.
And it is staggering when you consider, as Helen was pointing out, Senators Hawley, Blackburn, and Romney all being concerned about AI on the kind of R side of things. And then on the D side, Majority Leader Schumer, Senator Blumenthal, this is a hot topic. And if you were just to have that list of players on a sheet and say, all of these people are concerned about AI, you would be, I'm no Nate Silver, but I would bet on the idea that some legislation would have come across President Biden's desk by now with respect to AI. But instead, all we're looking at is this EO. And I wonder, when we're thinking about the lack of success so far, how do you all kind of diagnose why we've seen such stagnation on the Hill? Is it just because of this opposition between the ethicists and the doomers not being able to agree? Or is the larger factor this new formation of, as you were pointing out, Zach, this concentrated and focused effort by big tech to perhaps oppose any meaningful regulation? And Helen, I guess I'll turn that to you.
Yeah, I think I would probably say all of the above. I think certainly there was an effect you could see in the months after ChatGPT came out, and there was this enormous wave of public attention, this enormous wave of policymaker attention. And from, my perspective, kind of inside the field of AI policy, that was pretty surprising to people who had been paying attention to how the tech had developed. By the time ChatGPT came out, that was not technologically super new. There was a little bit new in there. The interface was new. The fact that it was freely available to the public was new. And the fact that it wasn't prone to some of the obvious failures that previous chatbots had trouble with. But I think there was a little bit of a readjustment period where people who had been working in this space, they weren't actually necessarily ready to have their big moment in the spotlight. So I think that was one factor. I definitely think that the sort of feuding or kind of disparate perspectives between these different groups also had an effect, because I think it meant that once policymakers started calling in experts and saying, okay, what do we do? What problems should we worry about? How do we fix them? If they're getting, 5 different answers when they call 5 different people, that's very difficult. It makes it very difficult to kind of coalesce around a certain set of solutions. I think they made some progress towards, here are some potential ideas for things we could implement. But then as soon as there was a real chance of that getting passed, that's when the big tech lobby kind of mobilized against that. So I think it is kind of multifactorial, which is always the boring answer. But one thing we're really trying to do in the piece as well is point out that I think AI conversations, there's AI policy conversations, there's 2 failure modes that I really think we need to move past. One is trying to handle everything all at once. And so saying, we shouldn't pass this bill because it only handles problem A, it doesn't handle problems B, C, D, and E. And, if you apply that standard, then you're never going to pass anything because, the chances of Congress really agreeing on a comprehensive bill that figures out everything at once is minuscule. So the one problem is that, trying to handle everything at once problem. I think the other problem is there's lots of ways to slice things up in AI. So people will often kind of get into like different sectors, how are different sectors being affected by AI, or different sort of manifestations of problems. And so something we really tried to do in the piece was, I sort of think of it as policy building blocks that are pretty basic and pretty fundamental, and that you would really want to have in place at this point because they're, the absence of them means that the field is really just totally empty and really lacking. So the kinds of things that we're suggesting, I think, didn't necessarily emerge as top priorities because they're not necessarily, if you're thinking about a particular issue, a particular type of harm, you don't necessarily first come to these kind of building blocks. But if you're looking at how do we build a broad coalition, how do we make recommendations that can get a lot of consensus, I think that's where you start to come to more of the kinds of things that we talk about in the piece.
Seeing this sort of analysis by paralysis that you're calling to attention, right? Where there are so many bills now. I mean, if you go on any AI legislation tracker, you are scrolling for pages of just all these different avenues you can go. And I think, as you were pointing out also, Helen, the difficulty of some of these pieces of legislation being framed as litmus tests. Right? If you're not for this piece of legislation, then we don't want to work for you at all or with you at all. And that kind of approach just doesn't fly in DC, right? Folks don't want to be pushed into a corner. Ultimately, especially as long as we have the filibuster, you're going to have to get to 60 senators. And getting 60 senators to agree on anything is difficult. But if you're going to make it a sort of litmus test approach, then you're almost certainly not going to get there. So turning to some of your regulatory low-hanging fruit. I guess the first one I'd love to dive into is this idea of investment in AI measurement science. And just saying those words doesn't, I think, evoke a whole lot for a whole lot of people. No offense. But Zach, can you explain what are we talking about here?
Yeah, no, we are really going for, the fame and fortune when we're pushing AI measurement science there. But I do think, Helen's point of thinking of all these recommendations and measurement, maybe more than any one of them, as sort of building blocks, as fundamental infrastructure for any sort of meaningful AI regulation, whether you're concerned on the present risk or on the future risk. That's the approach we take. And I think, measurement sounds very abstruse, but basic questions, is this model safe? Is this model biased, whether that's along a racial dimension, whether that's along a gender dimension? Will this model act reliably in a certain context when integrated with another system? Can we trust it? These are very basic questions that we do not have great answers to at this point. I mean, there's lots of very high quality work being done in the field of AI measurement and evaluation, but it's early days. And, even when there are promising approaches being developed, being released, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to sort of standardize them, to diffuse them comprehensively through society and make sure that everyone who should be working to those standards is set up with them. And so, this is another theme that's come up, I think, in some of the more thoughtful commentary on SB 1047 in California. Folks are saying, hey, you're trying to get us to evaluate ahead of time, whether these models are safe, or else we'll come in for these big penalties. We don't even really know how to answer those questions yet. And that's an objection that I think in some cases is cynical and in some cases is not. Like, I really empathize with it. We need better answers to those sorts of fundamental questions. And that's where public investment in this common good of measurement and technique can be really critical. And we see that in itself as a form of regulation, right? You want to oppose SB 1047 because we don't have, the building blocks for that kind of regulation. All right, advocate for this one. That's our argument in a nutshell in some ways.
No, well, yeah. I'm not certain it's going to sell on TikTok, but I do think this AI measurement science is quite important, and in particular,
Kevin, you didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a metrologist. That's what this is. Metrology. It has to make a comeback.
To be honest, that was never the goal. I think going into vexology, actually, the study of flags, that was my other pursuit. Speaking of random jobs, but this AI measurement science, as you were pointing out, Zach, this focus on investment too. It's not necessarily, hey, we need to agree tomorrow on this specific eval or the specific approach to auditing, but just investing in that science to begin with is the sort of R&D we've seen the government fund in other contexts. And so I do agree, as you all have framed the conversation too, if you're an ethicist, then you're excited about knowing more about these models and what harms they may cause to specific communities. And if you're a doomer, you also want to know what are the odds of this model ending the world. So in both contexts, that measurement science makes a lot of sense. So I guess your kind of second focus here would be on the importance of an effective ecosystem of third-party AI auditors. So Helen, can you distinguish between measurement science and evals and this idea of auditing and how a consensus may form behind this approach to creating an ecosystem of auditors?
Sure. Essentially, I think the distinction is that the role of auditors or independent third-party evaluators is to be testing claims that companies are making themselves about their AI systems. And so this is less about sort of the fundamental research of, well, how do we determine, which model is smarter than which other model or which risks it might pose, and more about kind of a governance or an access question of, and even an information question of who is able to actually make determinations in a given case. And so, of course, auditors, people hear audit, they think financial audit, where you have someone independent going in and verifying that a company, when the way that they're describing how they did their books is accurate. They've gone through and they've done everything in a legitimate way. But there's roles for, third-party certifiers, third-party evaluators in lots of different industries in terms of going in and checking that things have been done according to some standard, or going in and checking that the claims being made by a company are legitimate. And in general, I think that a huge problem for AI policy right now is sort of the information asymmetry between folks in industry who are working on extremely advanced systems and testing them and kind of making things up as they go along and determining for themselves what they think is appropriate, and regulators and the general public who are kind of only really able to see what's released via press releases. Occasionally you have a whistleblower come out and give you some additional information. But I think part of what I see the role of a third-party ecosystem being is giving you more ability to get access to some of that internal information. An alternative way of doing it, of course, is to just literally send in government regulators. The challenge of that is whether they can be nimble enough, whether they can be sophisticated enough technically, whether they can, hire and fire the right number of people to keep up with a growing or shrinking industry. So, in a lot of other spaces, we've seen this idea of you have some kind of set of third-party bodies where companies get to choose who they're going to work with, and the government gets to choose who is sort of counts as good enough, as a very flexible mechanism that kind of balances out some of these information and power asymmetries that you have by default.
And what seems so important to me about y'all's approach is you're not just calling for audits, period, right? Because this idea of audit washing, for lack of a better phrase, has been very real in the social media context. I think there's plenty of folks who would say, a human rights audit of you name the platform's content moderation strategies is a little sketchy sometimes as to the quality of the results. And so can you describe why you all see the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board? And for folks who aren't in admin law, we love to call that peekaboo. Helen, can you tell us more about why you think the PCAOB may be a good model in this context?
Yeah, so this is a recommendation that we took from a paper by Metrology and collaborators looking at third-party ecosystems in other industries and what we could learn from AI. And essentially, the core idea here is just that you, rather than having, again, the government going in directly to companies and trying to handle things themselves, you want to have independent, third-party, market-driven, ideally companies that are handling this. But you also want to have quality control. And so I didn't actually know Peekaboo was the way people pronounce that acronym. I love it. My understanding of Peekaboo's role in the financial industry is that they are setting standards. They are looking at companies that are, selling their auditing services and saying, are you doing an adequate job? Do you get the stamp of approval that if a company uses your services, then they're fulfilling their duties? So it's essentially just a question of roles and responsibilities and saying, okay, the government shouldn't be literally going in and doing this auditing work, but they can be setting the quality standards and making sure that private companies are kind of living up to those quality standards if they want to offer auditing services in this space.
This point about scrutiny of audits, whether it's audits that are now happening mostly internally or as third-party auditors start emerging, is really important and kind of dovetails with another one of our big points in the piece, which is transparency, not necessarily just to government regulators of auditors, but transparency to the broader public, right? Disclosure of these audits could be a really big deal. It's something that we see in a lot of other industries. And it's one sort of very important category of information that is getting strategically disclosed, partially disclosed, not disclosed at all right now. Having sort of a deeper public information ecosystem in this auditing aspect and in several others that we talk about, I think will be really important, just getting that sunshine in.
Yeah, and in particular, I think a huge issue that's going to have to be addressed is how are these audits going to be done in a way where it's not just transparency theater, but produced in a sort of language and tone that's actually understandable by the public. I mean, already I'd say the number of people who could describe a neural network to you probably isn't that high. And when we see audits on, for example, oh, you use this training data, but not that training data, my hunch is that the average Joe or Jane isn't going to say, yes, now I know not to use that model. And so having some government entity that can say, hey, not only do you need to be robust in your audits, but here's how you should produce it in a way that may actually facilitate public discourse, is going to be really interesting and a huge challenge. But we've got to start somewhere, as Helen pointed out. We can't just wait for the omnibus AI bill. So finally, one third issue that you all suggested may be ripe for consensus is tracking AI-related incidents. So Zach, I'll turn back to you and ask you to kind of detail why you think this may be a good area.
Well, I think on one level, it's sort of common sense, right? You want to be able to learn from failures. You want to be able to learn from mistakes. And in a lot of other areas of, sophisticated technologies that can go really badly, we've recognized for a long time that this is sort of a critical element of regulation. Think about any time a plane crashes, you have government inspectors on the scene, very quickly. We have, technologies that we've developed for this particular context, right? Black box technologies and so forth. Detailed reports are produced and so forth. That's maybe a longer term vision. But I think the general point that when things have gone wrong with these systems, we want to know that that's happened. We want to understand to the extent we can what contributed to those failures. And we want to diffuse that information back out to the community of model developers and others. That kind of just makes sense as a matter of good practice. And it's not something we have in any systematic way in AI right now. There's a lot of sort of civil society and nonprofit efforts that are really good. The AI incident database is one that I've had the pleasure of working with a little bit. But in general, I think both supporting those civil society efforts, but also sort of putting government scale resources, government scale investigatory powers, and just some more durable infrastructure around those efforts is really important. And again, is an approach that encompasses all sorts of, potential concerns about AI, right? Like whether it is a model that has been found to have misdiagnosed a lot of patients of a particular race, or it's a model that's just sort of acting unpredictably in a way that, could potentially lead to bigger problems as models become more sophisticated, right? Like you can imagine implications for many different kinds of AI risk on both fronts. So we want all that information coming into one place and sort of being useful to people of all sorts of perspectives on the issue.
So a lot of this boils down to just information gathering, which makes a ton of sense if you're in a novel field, if you're dealing with an emerging technology. It helps to understand what you need to govern before you actually go to that next level of questions about maybe steering it in particular normative directions and things like that. So Helen, obviously it's a great article. It's on Lawfare, so it's top of the top. And you all are wicked smart individuals. So tell me what the response has been. Are senators just clamoring for implementing these ideas? Have you received any outpouring of support from civil society? What's the response been like?
It's been really encouraging. I think, the first sign of success is I think we've seen a lot of positive uptake, retweets and, positive comments, nice emails from people on both sides of, the Doomer ethicist split, if we're going to call it that. That has been really validating to see different people who are known to represent pretty different poles in the debate saying, yes, we agree, these are good building blocks. That's a good place to start. I think right now, a lot of the discourse around AI policy is really focused around SB 1047. And I think the piece doesn't draw explicit links to that. So I think we'll wait and see how it kind of percolates into the broader debate. My sense is at the federal level, a lot of people are at this point just waiting for the election. So I'm hoping that this can be something that we can build on and point to over the years to come. I also do want to just call out, if I can, a couple of extra things in there that we recommend that do go beyond just sort of gathering information. One that's really important, and again, really nerdy sounding, is building capacity in government and in the public sector to make good regulations on AI or to handle AI issues well. So this is about, how well can they hire technical talent? What kind of education is available to people in these roles? And another is looking at liability and accountability. And so can we do better than, I know, topic that Lawfare has done a lot of great work on is software liability, cybersecurity liability. Not in my experience, I'm not a lawyer, but my impression is those are not known as fields where liability law is functioning, at its peak. And so can we do better than that when it comes to AI in terms of setting some guidance or ensuring that liability is allocated a little better through the different actors in the supply chain? So yeah, I think really positive response so far. Excited to kind of pick this up and move it forward as there's more energy for AI policy in the future.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't call out Gabe Wheel's scholarship on software liability. In particular, he's written pieces for Lawfare that curious listeners should check out. And Chinny Sharma out of Fordham has also written on this topic. So for those of you who are saying, I am inspired to find this strange bedfellow coalition and make it real, that may be two places to start. And Zach, speaking of kind of the future work that is ahead of anyone interested in AI regulation, regardless of who wins the 2024 election, are there any other areas that you all have turned your focus to now? Or if you were to write the piece again today, would you add any new proposals?
I mean, I think, having, again, like Helen was saying, having developed this piece as the debate over SB 1047 has been evolving, as, the bill itself has changed quite a bit. And seeing, like I was describing earlier, a lot of reactions that I'm not sure are entirely in good faith, but see the reason behind of it's so early, we don't know what we're doing, how can we put a strongly prescriptive regulation in mind, has just got me thinking, again, along the direction in the piece about, how do we develop regulation that is flexible, that iterates on itself, that develops the information that it needs to become stronger, right? And I do think, like we say in the piece, this is not a comprehensive agenda for AI governance. And I'm not sure we're at the point yet where we could articulate one for all the reasons we describe. But continuing to think about, again, how do we build the foundation through regulation, not just waiting for, some scientists or activists out there to create the preconditions for, the ground rules for AI, but how do we use regulation? How do we use government investment and these other public mechanisms we have to sort of build that vessel so that we can, go ahead? So maybe that's just a little bit more of the same. But again, I think that line of thinking has, as I've been watching California, just been over and over for me.
And if I can jump in there as well, I think that in my mind, the huge challenge for AI policy over the coming years will be to put a finer point on something Zach was saying, to keep pace with the field, not just as it's moving fast in one obvious direction where we all know where it's going. And it's just a question of how quickly it gets there. But also there's just so many dimensions of uncertainty of what kinds of systems are going to be capable of what kinds of things, where will AI be deployed in, which kinds of sectors, what kind of harms will we see. And, if you listen to some of the best funded, most advanced AI companies are telling you, yeah, we might have artificial general intelligence in 3 years. If that's true, we better be getting our skates on, and ready to figure out how to handle that. And we better be, the idea behind some of these policies is that they would help us figure out if that is true along the way. On the other hand, other people have very different expectations. And so I think that the challenge is for policymakers is to figure out how to be responsive and adaptive and knowing as quickly as possible what kinds of things to try and whether they're working. And so that I think is, one big underlying motivation for many of the ideas that we presented here.
Well, and if AGI does come about, Helen, I will let you take the skates. I'm going to go ahead and find a mansion to defend and protect, whatever I can do. I may be more aggressive than just finding a pair of skates, but I'll leave those to you. But on a more serious note, I do think you all are really hitting on a point. And again, this is where I transition into shameless self-promotion. My own take on this is the need for some sort of research regulation cycle where we've really not focused quite yet on the importance of research, on understanding the technology itself before getting to some of those headier, more specific regulatory approaches. And so it was very refreshing to see you all propose these tangible set of solutions that hopefully we can see a coalition form behind. And regardless of who wins in 2024, the website linking to your great work will continue to be available for anyone who's curious and decides that now's the moment for hitting some of these low-hanging targets. So thank you to you both, and I think we'll go ahead and leave it there.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks for having us.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.